Our last speaker, if you're from Los Angeles, needs absolutely no introduction. Paul, your boss was the third fastest billionaire in the history of the world. Our next speaker was the quickest person ever to become a billionaire in the United States, Mr. Gary Winnick. You can look it up on Wikipedia. I certainly did before I did a little this afternoon. Gary was on the front cover of Forbes magazine many years ago as the wealthiest person here in Los Angeles. And of all the people in the room, and I'm very close to all of you, Gary is not only one of my dearest friends, he's a mentor of mine. He has taught me an awful lot over the last 15 years. Gary and I have spent probably hundreds of hours, which is not an exaggerated number, talking late at night. He would call me sometimes when it would be 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning here, 10 o'clock, and we would talk for 2-3 hours about life in general, and I had a lot of ideas and plans, and I think Gary would have been one of the greatest presidents of the United States had he done that. He decided to become a serial entrepreneur. He is very charitable. He sits on the board of many companies. A wonderful dear friend. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Gary Winnick.
Thank you, Jason. I'd like to welcome all of you to this wonderful city, which I've made my home for 42 years. Jason said a lot of wonderful things about me. I'm not sure my wife would support all of the wonderful things that Jason has said, although I am married 49 years, which is a record in LA. Jason covered 3 areas. Well, I don't really follow scripts particularly well. So let me kind of just tell you the story the way I lived it. I was raised on Long Island. My parents were children of immigrants. I lived in a kind of middle to upper middle class family. I wasn't much of a student. My high school counselor told my parents, really don't waste your money on him, don't send him to college. Told my father, who ran his own business, you must have a truck laying around, let him drive the truck. My mother said, my father was fine with that, by the way, drive the truck. My mother said, no, you're gonna get a college education. She insisted. So I went to C.W. Post College, Long Island University. But I went there on a condition that I get a C+ my first year, or I'm out. Unfortunately, my freshman year, my father died unexpectedly. I got A's through my senior year. In my last year of college, I was drafted for the Vietnam War. I didn't really want to go to Vietnam. I didn't care for the weather. And I ended up going into the Air National Guard instead. But nevertheless, I did get pulled out of there. I did graduate, however. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, we moved to this little cushy neighborhood called Roslyn, New York, if any of you are familiar with it. And I woke up one morning and it was snowing. And the first thing you did is turn on the radio to make sure, listen for the school closings. And I heard, all Roslyn schools will be closed today. I immediately got dressed. My father was downstairs getting ready to go to work. He worked in Manhattan. He ran a small business. And he said, you and your brother are going to shovel our driveway, because he knew exactly what I was up to. He knew I was going to go out in the neighborhood and round up the other driveways to shovel. And he said, you're going to shovel our driveway first. Well, it was a nasty snowstorm. I'll never forget it. I went outside. My brother was older. And of course, he expected me to do the shoveling while he'd watch. And I walked out onto the street, and luckily for me, coming up the street is a Jeep with a snowplow in front, from probably one of the local gas stations, and I hailed the guy down, I pulled him over, and I said to him, "How much will you charge me to do my driveway?" And he says to me, $5. I said, "I'll give you $3. And he says, "Okay," and he cleans the driveway, doesn't do curb to curb, but does a pretty good job. In the meantime, I went out, I lived on a cul-de-sac, and there were 10 houses. I went out to all the other houses, and I rounded up all the jobs for $10 a driveway. So I had the guy go and do all the other driveways for $3 a driveway, and I made a $7 spread. So I knew from that point, at age 9 or 10, I don't know exactly what I was at the time, I'm going into finance.
Much better choice than physics.
So that was part of my journey. I got out of college, went into the military, had a couple of odd jobs, started to recruit, met my wife at the time, started interviewing on Wall Street, and just by happenstance, happened to walk into a retail office for a firm by the name of Drexel Burnham Lambert. And it was actually the only firm I had walked into where I actually met a live person. All the other firms I interviewed, it was all HR offices, it was fill out applications, take aptitude tests, and I met some real people. And they liked me, and they hired me. $260 a week. That was the pay. I said, well, that's a good start. My wife had some income. She was working, she's an artist, and she was a graphic illustrator at an ad agency, and I figured there's a good chance this girl and myself are going to get married, and let's see how it goes. Well, I took the job. I went into a sales training program, became a registered broker. In those days, they called you a stockbroker. Today, they have too many other fancy names. I don't know what they are. In those days, you peddled stocks. I pretty much sucked at it. I wasn't really good. The Dow in those days was trading at 1050, and over the next 18 months went to 550. So no matter what you sold people, by the time it settled, they were down. It was around the same time, I think in April of 1973, they created the CBOE. That looked pretty clever. You sell options against stocks, collect the dividend, you're never going to get called out because the stocks were declining. And then I also started to sell fixed income securities. The big shots in the major trading operation of the firm, which was down on Wall Street, took notice. They called me up and said, Winnick, come on downtown, we want to meet you. We want you to work on the high grade trading desk. I said, well, that's an uptake. And in 1975, working at the firm about two and a half years, I went to work in the major institutional trading firm, part of the firm, in sales. Well, 20 feet from where I sat was a small insular group of people. In those days, there were about 10 people. They didn't talk to anybody. They had their lunches brought in, where we had to go out for lunch. Nobody paid for our lunch. We knew they were making a lot of money, but they would never communicate with any of the other people in the group, and that was Mike Milken and his group of people. So I go, I'm 20 feet away from where the action is. I walked over to Mike one day, I said, hey Mike, I'd like to sell some of your product. It was heresy in those days for anyone in any profit center of the firm to sell Mike Milken's product. And I'm just looking to make an income. I've got one kid, another kid on the way, and Mike encouraged me to do it, and I started to sell some of Mike's product. And then in 1978, Mike said to me, I'm moving my group to LA. Would you like to join us? I thought my heart would pop out of my chest. I went home and told Karen, I said, Karen, how would you like to move to LA? She said, are you crazy? I go, no, we're going to LA. I felt like that TV show, The Jeffersons. We're moving uptown, Wheezy. And we came to LA. And so I'm going to give you two little stories about Drexel, which I think tell the story of Drexel that have really never been told. And you've read a lot about it, and you've heard a lot about it. I lived it. I sat across from Mike, 3 feet across from Mike. In the 70s and 80s, you had the emergence of leveraged buyouts. You had the emergence of private equity firms. Today, KKR is a brand name. In those days, it was a small firm. And there weren't very many firms. And in order for these firms to finance these leveraged buyouts, and they were $300 million, $500 million, $800 million deals, they needed mezzanine financing. A month after going to work for Mike, a guy calls me up and says, are you interested in buying a $1 million piece of a deal? I'm not an analyst. I have no idea what the guy's talking about. I said, sure, I like it. So I go to Mike. Mike says, what is it? I tell him what it is, but I really can't give him an opinion on it. He said, would you buy it? I said, I would if I had any money. I have no money. I got a house where Mike lent me the money to buy the house, put down the money for the mortgage. I've got a wife. I've got 2 kids now. My mother lent me money to buy a second car to come to LA. And I'm going limit on a deal that I can't even understand. And I said to Mike, Mike said, well, how much of the deal would you buy? I said, I'm good for 10%. Mike says to me, I'll lend you the money. So now Mike lends me the $100,000 to buy this deal. And 2 weeks after I buy it, I go, Gary, are you crazy? If you tell your wife what you just did, you're a goner. So now I got to figure out what to do. So I repackaged it, and I was listening to you, Paul, how you're repackaging these securities, right? Well, I did it because I was basically bankrupt. Okay? So I repackaged it as a bond, warrant. So I sold the bond to an institutional investor, and we kept the equity kicker. So we got all our money off the table, and we kept the equity at a 0 basis. That became the template for all of the leveraged buyouts of the 70s and the 80s. Okay? Drexel, looking back at the Drexel period, created modern finance. I don't think anyone would have any dispute with the impact that firm had. We financed the cellular industry. Here's the proposition. In the late 70s, when the FCC was granting licenses, they granted an A license and a B license. An A license went to an RBUC, a telephone company, and a B license went to entrepreneurs like all of you in this room. Except the entrepreneurs had 2 issues. They had no money, and they had no cash flow. So how are you going to spend billions of dollars to deploy networks when you have no money to invest and you have no cash flow? We had to create that solution. So we put the cellular industry on the map. The cable industry. John Malone, you know him today as Liberty. Media, and Liberty Cable. Well, John was the second generation of cable. And his proposition was build $1,000 coax cable to your house, generate $19 a month in revenue, and no programming. There was no programming. Where do you find the money? And Steve Wynn. Steve Wynn was the next generation of the casino industry. The first generation was the mob. Las Vegas was built by the mob. And every casino in Las Vegas was given to a mob family from a city across the country to keep peace. When they got run out of town in the 60s and the 70s, the only ones left were their lawyers. And then there was an emergence of a new breed of players. Steve Wynn was that next generation. So here's a funny story how Steve Wynn plays not in only the next generation of gaming and the mega resorts, which we at Drexel financed, but how Steve actually played in the hostile takeover business. And then I'm going to pass this back, and I'll stick around. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And if you want to talk about telecom and global crossing and all that stuff, I'll be happy to. I'm taking a lot of your time, so thank you. So Steve is giving Mike and myself a ride back to LA from New York. We're on Steve's plane, and we're pitching Steve to put $300 million in a hostile takeover for Gulf Oil, circa 1983. I'm going to have my year off a little bit, but not by much. Steve's sitting on the plane with Clyde Turner, who happened to be his CFO. Steve says, I don't have the money. Clyde says, Steve, you can't responsibly commit $300 million when you don't have it. And Mike says to Steve, if you get called on the money, I'll raise it for you. And Clyde says, well, we're not getting anything for it. I said, Clyde will pay you a point for the commitment. So picture this, we're paying them a point for a commitment of money they don't have, that they're committing $300 million for, so Boone Pickens can tee up Gulf Oil, so Gulf Oil will pay Greenmail to Boone Pickens and buy them out. That was hostile takeovers of the 80s. Thank you very much.
When does your book come out?
We'll do 5 or 6 for anybody else.
You heard Jason. We'll take maybe 4 or 5 questions. If somebody has a question, please raise your hand. We'll get